Put down your keys and buckle up because you have no idea how close your grandparents came to dying on their morning commute. The history of the automobile is not just about engines and tires. It is a horror show of radioactive trunks, flamethrower doors, and steering wheels specifically designed to stab you in the chest. I have compiled 111 banned, illegal, and absolutely lethal innovations that engineers actually thought were a good idea. Smash that like button and subscribe right now, or I will replace your airbags with a box of angry bees. Let's hit the road. 1. In 1935, Popular Mechanics introduced the dog sack, which was a canvas bag designed to hang your pet outside the speeding car window. This genius invention hooked onto the door and dangled your terrified dog over the pavement so he could enjoy the fresh air without getting hair on the seats. It looked like a straitjacket for golden retrievers and offered absolutely zero protection if another car drifted too close. You were driving along comfortably while your poor dog was one rusty clip away from becoming a roadside tragedy. The innovation was quickly abandoned because people realized that preserving clean upholstery was not worth launching Fido into oncoming traffic. 2. The 1958 Ford Nucleon was a bold concept that replaced the standard gas tank with a literal nuclear reactor located in the trunk. Ford engineers believed American families wanted to drive around with a miniature Chernobyl strapped to the back of their sedan to get 5,000 miles of range. The pitch sounded amazing until safety regulators realized the catastrophic risks of putting uranium in a commuter vehicle. If you got into a minor fender bender at the grocery store, you would not just dent the bumper, you would nuke the entire neighborhood. The project was scrapped because a simple traffic accident should not require a hazmat team. 3. In 1998, a South African inventor created the blaster, specifically to stop carjackings by shooting literal jets of fire from the side of the car. The system used liquefied gas nozzles installed under the doors to roast anyone standing within 2 meters of the vehicle alive. It was completely legal to buy a BMW that could barbecue a human being at the push of a button like a Bond villain car. The problem was that in a panic, drivers could easily torch innocent beggars or people asking for directions. It was eventually banned effectively because turning public streets into a fiery war zone was considered a bit too extreme, even for crime prevention. 4. In 1956, Chrysler offered the Highway Hi-Fi system, which was an actual vinyl record player mounted directly under the dashboard. They developed special heavy records to prevent skipping, but physics does not care about your luxury features when you hit a pothole. Every time the car went over a bump, the needle would jump and scratch your favorite tunes while you tried to fix it at 60 miles per hour. Drivers were staring at the turntable instead of the road, causing accidents just to hear the end of a song. The option was discontinued after 2 years because warranties for broken players were costing Chrysler a fortune. 5. In the 1950s, Brooks Walker invented the fifth-wheel parking gadget that lowered a spare tire from the trunk to swing the car sideways. It looked like magic because it lifted the rear wheels off the ground and rotated the entire vehicle into tight, parallel parking spots. The fatal flaw was that the hydraulic mechanism took up the entire trunk, leaving zero room for luggage or groceries. The complex system also leaked fluid constantly and often broke, leaving your car stranded with its butt in the air. Auto manufacturers rejected the idea because sacrificing your entire storage space just to park slightly faster was a terrible trade. 6. In the 1970s, taxi fleets in San Francisco tested bumpers filled with gallons of water designed to absorb the impact of low-speed collisions. The theory was that upon impact, the water would shoot out of plugs and cushion the blow like a hydraulic shock absorber. The reality was that in winter, the water froze into solid blocks of ice, effectively turning the bumper into a concrete battering ram. In summer, minor fender benders resulted in the bumpers bursting and spraying gallons of water all over the accident scene. They were abandoned because carrying around heavy water tanks on the front of cars was inefficient and messy. 7. In 1965, Ford replaced the standard steering wheel with the wrist twist system, which used 2 tiny spinning dials for your hands. It looked futuristic and freed up legroom, but it offered absolutely zero mechanical leverage for the driver in an emergency. If the power steering pump failed, you would physically be unable to turn the wheels and would drive straight into a concrete wall. Test drivers found the controls overly sensitive and twitchy, making the car feel unstable at highway speeds. Ford buried the project because giving drivers tiny useless knobs instead of a proper wheel was a safety lawsuit waiting to happen. 8. In the 1990s, manufacturers like General Motors installed automatic seatbelts that ran along a motorized track to pin you against the seat. The shoulder belt would slide into place when you closed the door, creating a false sense of security while leaving your lap completely unbuckled. If the motorized track broke, you were trapped inside the car, unable to escape during a fire or underwater emergency. Even worse, if the door popped open during a crash, the belt would rip away and leave you with zero protection. These hated devices were banned and replaced by airbags because they killed more people than they saved. 9. For most of the 20th century, brake pads were made with asbestos because it was cheap and excellent at absorbing the massive heat of friction. Every time a driver tapped the brakes, a cloud of microscopic toxic dust was released into the air and the wheel wells. Mechanics who used compressed air to clean out brake drums were inhaling pure carcinogens daily without any protective gear whatsoever. The innovation was a public health disaster that poisoned millions of people just to stop cars effectively. Asbestos was finally banned in friction materials because the industry realized that stopping a car shouldn't involve giving everyone lung cancer. 10. Pop-up headlights were the coolest design feature of the 80s, found on everything from the Corvette to the Mazda Miata. While they looked sleek, when closed, the open lights created sharp, protruding metal edges that were deadly to pedestrians. If a car hit a person, the headlights acted like meat cleavers that caused severe lacerations and trauma instead of allowing the body to roll over the hood. Safety regulations in Europe and America updated their standards to ban rigid protruding objects from the front of vehicles. The iconic feature disappeared from production lines because looking cool was not worth slicing up pedestrians during accidents. 11. In the 1930s, luxury cars featured rear-hinged doors that we now affectionately call suicide doors for a very good reason. The design looked elegant, but if a passenger accidentally unlatched the door while moving, the wind would catch it like a giant sail. Instead of closing shut, the air pressure would rip the door wide open and violently drag the passenger out of the vehicle onto the road. There were zero safety locks, so a curious child in the back seat could easily be ejected at highway speeds. Manufacturers eventually moved the hinges to the front because losing grandma on the freeway was bad for repeat business. 12. In 1961, Goodyear decided that regular black rubber was boring and invented translucent tires filled with 18 tiny light bulbs. These glowing tires came in bright colors to match your dress or lipstick and turned your car into a rolling light show at night. The problem was that the synthetic rubber required to let the light through was about as durable as a wet paper towel. They wore out after a few miles of driving and would often shatter like glass if you hit a bump. Goodyear canceled the project because tires that look like Christmas ornaments are useless if they explode before you get to the party. 13. The Reliant Robin was a British attempt to make a car cheaper by removing a wheel, which is like saving money on a chair by removing a leg. With one wheel in the front and two in the back, the car was physically incapable of turning a corner without falling over. If you took a turn faster than 10 miles per hour, the laws of physics would tip the entire vehicle onto its side. Owners literally had to carry cement blocks in the passenger seat just to keep the car balanced while driving alone. It remains a joke in automotive history because a car that naps on its side is useless. 14. During the fuel shortages of World War II, desperate drivers converted their cars to run on burning wood or coal, using giant gasifiers strapped to the bumper. You literally had to light a fire on the back of your vehicle and wait for the fumes to power the engine like a steam train. The car had the acceleration of a glacier and required you to stop every few miles to shovel soot and add more logs. It was a dirty and exhausting way to travel that left you smelling like a chimney sweep. Once gasoline returned, everyone abandoned these monstrosities because driving shouldn't require a shovel and a bag of charcoal. 15. Before the 1960s, the steering column was simply a solid metal steel rod aimed directly at the driver's heart. In a head-on collision, the car would stop abruptly, but the steering wheel would stay put, acting like a stationary spear. Drivers were routinely impaled through the chest by their own vehicle, turning survivable accidents into fatal stabbings. It was a gruesome design flaw that treated the human sternum like a pincushion during every crash. The government finally mandated collapsible steering columns because having a metal spike pointed at your chest was considered a bit too aggressive for a family commute. 16. In 1969, Ford introduced the rim blow steering wheel, which replaced the horn button with a squeeze sensor inside the rim. The idea was to let you honk without moving your hands, but it turned into a nightmare of accidental noise pollution. If you gripped the wheel too tight during a turn, you would blast the horn and scare everyone around you. In cold weather, the rubber hardened and shrank, causing the horn to get stuck and scream continuously until the battery died. Ford discontinued the feature because drivers got tired of looking like angry road rage maniacs every time they parked the car. 17. The 1971 Buick Riviera featured a design called the boat tail, which tapered the rear end to a sharp point like a yacht. It looked incredibly stylish on paper, but in reality it made the trunk almost completely useless for carrying actual luggage. The V-shaped rear window also created a massive blind spot that made reverse parking a complete guessing game for the driver. You were basically driving a land yacht that couldn't carry groceries and was impossible to park without hitting a pole. Sales tanked because American buyers realized that aerodynamic styling was not worth sacrificing the ability to see what was behind them. 18. In 1981, Cadillac tried to save fuel with the V8 6.4 engine, which was supposed to shut off cylinders when they were not needed. The computer technology was so primitive that it couldn't keep up with highway speeds, causing the car to jerk violently. It felt like the engine was hunting for power and would buck like a mechanical bull while you were trying to cruise. The system was so unreliable that mechanics would simply cut the wires to force it to stay in V8 mode permanently. It was a humiliation for Cadillac, proving that you cannot fix bad gas mileage with a computer that thinks slower than a toaster. 19. In the 1920s, General Motors discovered that adding lead to gasoline stopped engine knocking and made cars run smoother. They knew it was a potent neurotoxin, but decided to pump it into the atmosphere anyway to protect their engine valves. For decades, every single car on the road was spraying a fine mist of brain-damaging poison into the air we breathed. Studies later showed it lowered the collective IQ of the entire global population and caused a spike in violent crime rates. Lead was finally banned from fuel when the world realized that engine performance was not worth giving everyone permanent brain damage. 20. The 1957 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham was the ultimate luxury car that actually encouraged you to drink while driving. The glove box came standard with a set of magnetic shot glasses and a tray designed to hold your liquor bottle steady on the road. It was a factory-installed drunk driving kit that made it easy to mix a cocktail while doing 70 on the highway. The magnets kept the glasses from sliding, but did nothing to stop the driver from swerving into a ditch. As drunk driving laws became stricter, this feature was quietly removed because handing drivers a shot glass was a liability nightmare. 21. In the 1970s, American car manufacturers decided that steel was too boring and what people really wanted was to drive a fake tree. They slapped giant vinyl stickers of wood grain onto the sides of station wagons to give them a rustic cabin vibe. The problem was the sun would peel the adhesive after one hot summer, making your brand new car look like rotting driftwood. It offered zero structural support and was purely a cosmetic disaster that trapped moisture and encouraged rust. The trend finally died because people realized that gluing wallpaper to a vehicle does not make it luxurious, it just makes it flammable. 22. Chrysler built a car in the 60s powered by a literal jet engine that sounded like a vacuum cleaner and ran on anything from tequila to perfume. The turbine car was smooth and futuristic, but the exhaust was hotter than the surface of the sun. If you idled at a traffic light, the heat blast from the rear would melt the asphalt on the road and singe the hair off pedestrians' legs. It was an engineering marvel that was totally impractical because turning city streets into molten lava is generally frowned upon. Chrysler crushed almost all of them because the world wasn't ready for a car that doubled as a hairdryer. 23. Before modern safety glass windshields were made of standard plate glass, just like the windows in your house. This meant that in a crash, the glass didn't shatter into safe pebbles, it broke into giant jagged shards. A minor head-on collision would turn the windshield into a guillotine that could decapitate the driver and passengers instantly. Doctors in emergency rooms called it the necklace effect because of the horrific injuries caused by flying glass. The industry was forced to switch to laminated safety glass because surviving the impact only to be sliced up by your own window was a terrible way to go. 24. In the days before coffee energy drinks, an inventor created the chine arm alarm to keep sleepy drivers awake. It was a plastic box you strapped to your face that would buzz violently if your chin dropped down. The device didn't actually make you alert, it just startled you into a panic while you were steering a heavy metal death machine. Drivers found it so annoying that they would rip it off and throw it out the window in a fit of rage. It failed because shocking an exhausted person while they are driving 70 miles per hour usually results in a heart attack, not a safe arrival. 25. In the disco era, luxury meant covering the entire inside of your car in thick, fluffy velour that felt like a cheap motel sofa. It looked cozy in the showroom, but was a nightmare in reality because the fabric trapped every fart and cigarette puff forever. If you dropped a lit cherry from your smoke, the synthetic material would ignite faster than a pile of dry leaves. The interior became a permanent sponge for odors and bacteria that could not be cleaned no matter how hard you scrubbed. The trend vanished because people got tired of driving around in a highly flammable sweat sponge. 26. Henry Ford was obsessed with agriculture and decided to build a car body entirely out of plastic made from soybeans. It was lightweight and dent-resistant, which sounded like the future of sustainable manufacturing until nature intervened. The organic smell of the soy plastic was so appetizing that goats and rats would literally walk up and eat your fender. Imagine coming out of the grocery store to find a farm animal chewing a hole through your passenger door. The project was abandoned because building a vehicle that doubles as a snack for local wildlife is a terrible business model. 27. The Ford Pinto was an economy car designed to be cheap, but the engineers cut corners by placing the gas tank behind the rear axle. This genius placement meant that the fuel tank acted as a bumper during a rear-end collision. If someone tapped your back bumper at 30 miles per hour, the tank would rupture and spray gas everywhere, turning the car into a fireball. It became infamous for incinerating drivers in minor accidents that should have been harmless fender benders. Ford recalled the cars after a memo leaked showing they knew about the deadly flaw, but thought paying lawsuits was cheaper than fixing it. 28. In the 80s, technology was booming, so cars like the Chrysler LeBaron were given a robotic voice to warn drivers about problems. The car would constantly shout phrases like, "Your door is ajar," in a monotone voice that sounded like a malfunctioning Terminator. The novelty wore off immediately when the sensor glitching started, and the car would scream at you at 3 in the morning. Drivers wanted to smash the dashboard with a hammer just to make the robot shut up. The feature was removed because getting nagged by your own vehicle was the most annoying driving experience ever invented. 29. The Mercedes gullwing doors are legendary for looking cool, but they came with a deadly design flaw that nobody discussed. The doors hinged at the roof and opened upwards, which meant they needed vertical clearance to work. If you flipped the car onto its roof during a crash, you were completely sealed inside your own vehicle with no way out. Rescuers would have to use the jaws of life to cut you out while you panicked inside the crushed cabin. Modern versions use explosive bolts to blow the doors off, but the originals were basically beautiful steel coffins waiting for a rollover. 30. Before paper air filters became standard, cars used a heavy metal canister filled with a literal pool of oil to trap dust. It worked well enough on a tractor, but was a disaster on a passenger car taking sharp corners. If you turned the steering wheel too aggressively, the oil would slosh out of the bath and spill directly into the carburetor. The engine would choke on the oil and stall out, leaving you stranded in the middle of a turn. Manufacturers switched to dry paper filters because having a bucket of loose oil sitting on top of a hot engine was stupid. 31. In 1961, Ford introduced the swing-away steering wheel for drivers who were too lazy to slide their legs under the column. You could push the transmission into park, and the entire steering wheel would slide 18 inches to the right so you could exit gracefully. It was a neat party trick until the locking mechanism wore out, and the wheel decided to swing away while you were doing 60 on the highway. Suddenly, you were sitting in the driver's seat with no steering wheel in front of you, screaming as the car drifted into a ditch. The feature was removed because steering is generally considered a full-time job. 32. If you bought a custom van in the 1970s, you probably opted for the wall-to-wall shag carpeting that was thick enough to lose your keys in. It looked groovy for about a week until it became a permanent trap for spilled soda mud and unmentionable bacteria. You could not vacuum the deep pile effectively, so the floor turned into a living ecosystem of mold and funky odors that hit you every time you opened the door. It was like driving around inside a dirty gym sock that you could never wash. The trend died because people realized that cars should be able to be cleaned without a hazmat suit. 33. Car makers in the 70s decided to charge extra for the Landau roof, which was just a sheet of vinyl glued to a metal hardtop to fake a convertible look. It was the automotive equivalent of a bad toupee that fooled absolutely nobody on the road. The vinyl acted like a sponge, trapping rainwater and salt directly against the metal roof where you couldn't see it. Owners would drive blissfully unaware until the roof rusted completely through and the headliner collapsed on their heads. The style was abandoned because paying more money to make your car rust faster was a scam even for the 70s. 34. A French engineer thought wheels were boring, so he built the Layet Helica, which was pulled by a giant airplane propeller mounted right on the nose. It was basically a wingless plane that chopped up anything in its path like a rolling blender. There was no cage around the spinning blades, so any pedestrian who stepped off the curb risked getting minced into fine confetti. The noise was so deafening that the driver couldn't hear sirens or screams from the terrified people diving out of the way. It was banned from public roads because driving a giant fan blade through traffic is obviously a public safety nightmare. 35. Racing enthusiasts love magnesium rims because they are incredibly lightweight, but they forget that magnesium is also a highly flammable metal used in flashbulbs. If you got a flat tire and the rim scraped against the asphalt, the friction sparks could ignite the wheel itself. Once magnesium starts burning, it burns white hot and cannot be extinguished by water, which actually makes the fire explode violently. Firefighters would literally have to stand back and watch your car melt into a puddle of slag because they couldn't put it out. True magnesium wheels vanished from streetcars because a flat tire shouldn't turn your vehicle into a road flare. 36. Before electric motors became standard windshield wipers, were powered by the engine's vacuum pressure, which was a terrifying design flaw. The system worked fine when you were idling, but the moment you stepped on the gas to pass a truck, the vacuum dropped to zero. This meant that exactly when you needed to see the most, the wipers would freeze dead in the middle of the glass. You were left blind doing 70 miles per hour in a rainstorm just because you tried to accelerate. The industry finally switched to electric wipers because seeing the road while driving fast is actually quite important. 37. Land Rover wanted to look rugged, so they mounted the heavy spare tire directly on top of the engine hood, right in front of the windshield. It gave the vehicle a safari vibe, but it also blocked a massive chunk of the driver's view of the road ahead. If a small child or a dog ran in front of the bumper, you would never see them because a giant rubber donut was in your face. Lifting the hood to check the oil also required bench pressing a 50-pound wheel, which was a back-breaking chore. The design was dropped because seeing where you are driving is a basic requirement. 38. The Stanley Steamer was a car that ran on boiling water, which sounds clean until you realize you had to wake up 30 minutes early just to start it. You had to light a pilot light and wait for the boiler to build up pressure before you could even back out of the driveway. If the boiler pressure got too high, there was a genuine risk of the tank exploding and scalding everyone nearby with superheated steam. Gasoline cars won the war because nobody wanted to perform a chemistry experiment every morning just to drive to the grocery store for milk. 39. Old school drivers love to brag about heavy chrome bumpers that could smash through a brick wall without a scratch. The problem was that these solid steel beams did not absorb any energy during a crash. They transferred 100% of the force to the passengers. The car would look pristine after an accident, but the driver inside would have a broken neck from the whiplash. Modern cars crumple like soda cans to save your life by absorbing the impact energy. Those old tanks were banned because saving the car is pointless if the people inside are dead. 40. In the 50s, General Motors introduced mechanical fuel injection, which was a high-tech way to spray gas into the engine for more power. The system was so complex and poorly sealed that it was prone to leaking raw fuel directly onto the scorching hot engine block. Owners would be driving their Corvette down the street and suddenly smell gas right before the hood erupted in flames. It was so unreliable that most owners ripped the expensive system out and replaced it with a cheap carburetor. The technology was abandoned for decades until computers could manage it without burning down the garage. 41. In the 1970s, nothing said you were cool like T-top roofs, which were two removable glass panels that promised the freedom of a convertible. They looked amazing in the showroom, but in reality they were a leaky engineering disaster that hated keeping water out. The rubber seals would dry out and crack within months, meaning every time it rained you got a cold shower directly in your lap while driving. Owners had to carry towels everywhere just to keep their pants dry during a storm. The design eventually disappeared because people realized that a roof that does not keep the weather out is technically just a hole. 42. Before emissions laws existed, some manufacturers put two-stroke engines in cars, which is the same smoky engine you find in a chainsaw. You had to mix oil directly into the gas tank, which created a thick cloud of blue smog behind you everywhere you went. The car sounded like an angry lawnmower and polluted more than 100 modern vehicles combined. Driving behind one of these was a guaranteed way to get a headache from the toxic fumes. They were banned in most of the world because poisoning the air just to drive to the grocery store was no longer acceptable. 43. General Motors designed a line of pickup trucks with the gas tanks mounted outside the protective frame rails right under the doors. This side saddle design meant that the fuel tank was the first thing to get hit during a side impact crash. It turned a survivable T-bone accident into a massive explosion because the tank had zero protection from being crushed. The design resulted in massive lawsuits and a public relations nightmare after trucks started catching fire on the news. The design was scrapped because using a gas tank as a shield for the frame was a lethal engineering choice. 44. Old steering wheels featured a chrome horn ring that floated inside the wheel so you could honk with your thumbs without moving your hands. It was convenient until you got into a crash and the rigid metal ring became a rib-crushing weapon. Without seatbelts, the driver would be thrown forward and their chest would slam directly into this protruding circle of steel. Surgeons dealt with so many crushed sternums that they specifically blamed this styling feature for fatal internal injuries. The ring was replaced by soft padded buttons because a horn should alert pedestrians not break your bones. 45. In the 1950s, designers were obsessed with streamlining, so they added fender skirts, which were metal panels covering the rear wheels. They made the car look like a floating spaceship, but they made changing a flat tire an absolute nightmare. You had to find tools to unbolt the skirt just to access the lug nuts while stranded on the side of the road. If the bolts were rusted, you were completely out of luck and stuck waiting for a tow truck. The style died out because looking aerodynamic was not worth the anger of wrestling with a metal panel in the rain. 46. Before electric headlights became standard, early cars used acetylene gas lamps that you literally had to light with a match. You had to open a valve to let the gas flow and then hold a flame to the headlight, which is terrifying near a fuel source. If you drove too fast, the wind would blow the flame out, leaving you driving blind in total darkness at 40 miles per hour. Sometimes the gas pressure would build up and the headlight would simply explode in your face. We switched to electric bulbs because lighting a fire on the front of your car is primitive. 47. Many vintage hoods were hinged at the rear, which meant the latch was at the front near the grille, just like today. The deadly difference was that if the latch failed while driving, the wind would catch the hood and slam it backward instantly. The heavy metal sheet would smash the windshield and completely blind the driver while they were moving at highway speeds. It caused countless accidents because you suddenly had a metal wall in front of your face. Manufacturers moved the latch to the windshield side or added safety catches so a loose hood wouldn't become a blindfold. 48. In 1986, Buick installed the first touchscreen in a car, which was a green CRT monitor that looked like an old computer. It controlled everything from the radio to the climate, but it was frustratingly slow and impossible to read in sunlight. To change the volume, you had to take your eyes off the road and tap a glass screen that barely registered your finger. It was a massive distraction that forced drivers to stare at a glowing box instead of the traffic ahead. The tech was abandoned for decades because it was way too ahead of its time to be safe. 49. In the 1950s, Chrysler offered swivel seats that spun outward to make getting in and out of the car easier for ladies in skirts. It was a great party trick until the locking mechanism failed during a sharp turn or a collision. If the seat unlocked while driving, the driver would suddenly spin around to face the back seat while the car was still moving. In a crash, the swivel base was a weak point that could break and launch the entire seat through the windshield. The feature was dropped because staying pointed at the road is actually critical for driving. 50. During the fuel crisis, car makers installed an economy light on the dashboard that would flash orange if you pressed the gas pedal too hard. It was intended to help you save fuel, but it felt like having a nagging librarian sitting in the passenger seat. Drivers absolutely hated being scolded by their own car every time they tried to merge onto the highway or pass a truck. The light was so annoying that many people simply smashed the bulb or put electrical tape over it. It was removed because annoying the driver into a rage is not a good way to save gas. 51. Dashboard safety did not exist in the 50s, so designers filled the interior with sharp metal knobs and rigid steel surfaces. The heater controls and radio buttons stuck out like spikes directly in front of the passenger's knees. In even a minor sudden stop, the passenger would slide forward and smash their kneecaps against these jagged metal protrusions. It was a design that turned a small fender bender into a lifetime of walking with a cane. Padded dashes and recessed buttons became law because knee surgery should not be a standard consequence of braking hard. 52. The first car phones were massive bricks wired into the center console that cost thousands of dollars and $3 a minute to use. They were a status symbol for 80s businessmen who wanted to close deals while swerving across 3 lanes of traffic. The cords would get tangled around the gear shift, and dialing a number required looking down for 10 seconds straight. It was the beginning of distracted driving, but with a phone the size of a shoebox. They were phased out for handhelds because hardwiring a phone into a car was clunky and dangerous. 53. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you remember the torture of sitting on vinyl seats on a hot summer day. The plastic material did not breathe at all and would heat up to temperatures that could literally cook an egg. When you sat down wearing shorts, the seat would sear your skin and then stick to your legs like superglue. Getting out of the car involved a painful peeling sound and a layer of your own skin left behind on the seat. Cloth and leather took over because nobody wants to drive a car that feels like a frying pan. 54. In the 1930s, some cars had a freewheel lever that disconnected the engine from the wheels when you took your foot off the gas. It allowed the car to coast for miles to save fuel, but it also meant you had absolutely no engine braking. If you were going down a steep hill and the brakes overheated, you had no way to slow the vehicle down. You became a runaway train picking up speed until you crashed or rolled over into a ditch. The feature was banned because the ability to stop the car is slightly more important than saving a nickel on gas. 55. The front bench seat was a romantic feature that allowed your sweetheart to slide right next to you while you drove. The danger was that there was no divider or bucket shape to hold the driver in place during a turn. If you took a sharp corner, the driver would slide all the way across the slippery vinyl bench to the passenger side. You would end up hanging onto the steering wheel for dear life just to stay in position to control the car. Bucket seats became standard because staying behind the wheel is a non-negotiable requirement for driving safely. 56. Before radial tires became the standard, cars used bias. Ply tires, which were made with crisscrossed layers of stiff fabric cord. They were terrible at holding their shape and would develop flat spots if the car sat parked overnight. The first 5 miles of your morning commute felt like you were driving a jackhammer, as the tires thumped loudly until they warmed up. They also had poor grip and would follow every groove in the road, causing the car to wander dangerously. Radials took over because driving on square tires every morning was a miserable way to start the day. 57. In the 70s, style was more important than sight, so designers added tiny opera windows to the rear pillars of luxury coupes. These portholes were about the size of a playing card and offered absolutely zero visibility for the driver. They created massive blind spots that could hide an entire semi-truck or a pedestrian from view. You were basically driving inside a steel bunker with a peephole that was purely decorative. The trend died because changing lanes without crashing requires actually being able to see the road around you. 58. In a misguided attempt to boost power, some engines were designed to inject water into the combustion chamber to cool the cylinders. The theory was sound for racing, but in a daily driver, it was a recipe for destroying the engine from the inside out. If the system was not maintained perfectly, the water would cause massive internal rust and corrosion on the pistons and valves. Owners found their engines seizing up because they were literally spraying water into a machine made of iron. The idea was scrapped because rust is the natural enemy of engines, and inviting it inside was stupid. 59. Early seatbelts were just a single strap across the lap, which prevented you from flying out but caused other horrific injuries. In a head-on crash, your upper body would jackknife forward violently while your waist stayed pinned to the seat. This motion would smash your face directly into the steering wheel or dashboard, often breaking your nose or jaw. Even worse, the force on your abdomen could cause severe internal organ damage and spinal injuries. The three-point shoulder belt was invented to stop you from folding in half like a cheap lawn chair. 60. British car manufacturers like MG and Triumph used a positive ground electrical system where the chassis was wired as the positive terminal. This was the opposite of the rest of the world and caused endless confusion for mechanics and owners. If you tried to jumpstart the car using a standard American vehicle, you would create a massive short circuit. The sparks would fly and you would instantly fry the entire wiring harness and possibly the battery. The industry standardized to negative ground because blowing up your electrical system during a jumpstart was a frustrating way to ruin a weekend. 61. In 1980, Cadillac decided to ruin the Seville by adding a bustle-back trunk that was designed to look like a 1930s carriage. It was a strange hump added to the rear of the car that made it look like the vehicle was wearing a full diaper. The design was extremely controversial because it completely destroyed the aerodynamic profile and looked ridiculous on a modern luxury sedan. Critics called it the hunchback of the highway, and resale values plummeted because nobody wanted to be seen driving it. The styling cue was quickly abandoned because making a new car look like an ancient relic is a terrible marketing strategy. 62. Inventors have always dreamed of cars that run on compressed air because air is free and clean, but the reality is a logistical nightmare. These vehicles used high-pressure tanks to power pistons, but the energy density was so low that you could barely drive 3 miles. You would get to the end of your driveway and realize you were already out of fuel and needed a massive industrial compressor to recharge. The range anxiety was unbearable because, unlike gas stations, you cannot just find high-pressure air pumps everywhere. The concept failed because a car that cannot leave the neighborhood is basically a golf cart. 63. Early sports cars like the Corvette and Lotus used fiberglass body panels because they were lightweight and rust-proof compared to steel. The deadly downside was that in a crash, fiberglass does not crumple to absorb energy. It simply shatters into razor-sharp splinters. The driver was left with absolutely zero structural protection because the car body disintegrated on impact like a plastic toy. You were basically driving inside a fragile eggshell that offered no defense against a heavy metal truck. Modern cars use advanced composites because relying on brittle plastic to save your life in a collision is a fatal mistake. 64. In the 90s, manufacturers introduced early rain sensing wipers that used optical sensors to detect moisture on the windshield. The technology was so primitive that it would often hallucinate and trigger the wipers violently inside dry tunnels or parking garages. Drivers would be cruising along peacefully when suddenly the wipers would slap back and forth at maximum speed, scaring them half to death. Conversely, during a light misty rain, the sensors would often fail to activate, leaving the driver blinded. The systems were overhauled because having a car that wipes away imaginary rain while ignoring the real storm is deeply frustrating. 65. For a few decades, American car makers thought it was clever to hide the fuel filler cap behind a spring-loaded taillight or license plate. It gave the car a smooth look, but it created mass confusion for anyone renting a car for the first time. Drivers would pull up to the gas pump and spend 20 minutes circling the vehicle looking for a fuel door that did not exist. You often had to find a secret button in the glove box just to pop the taillight open to refuel. The hidden cap was abandoned because getting gas is a chore that shouldn't require a scavenger hunt. 66. Before catalytic converters were perfected, engineers used a device called a thermal reactor to burn off excess exhaust emissions. This unit got incredibly hot, reaching temperatures that were high enough to ignite dry grass or leaves under the car. If you parked your vehicle on a lawn at a family picnic, you risked starting a wildfire that could burn down the entire neighborhood. The extreme heat also cooked the engine oil and damaged internal components, causing the car to fail prematurely. The reactor was replaced because an emissions device that doubles as an arson tool is generally considered a bad idea. 67. The pillarless hardtop was a gorgeous design trend where there was no structural support post between the front and rear windows. It created a sleek open-air look when the windows were down, but it compromised the structural integrity of the roof. If the car rolled over in an accident, the roof would collapse flat like a pancake because there was nothing to hold it up. Passengers had zero protection from being crushed by the weight of the vehicle during a rollover event. The design was outlawed by safety regulations because looking stylish is not worth being flattened by your own roof. 68. The 1980s saw an explosion of digital dashboards that looked like sci-fi movie props but worked like broken calculators. These early electronic displays used vacuum fluorescent tubes that were almost impossible to read in direct sunlight. If the sun hit the dash, you had no idea how fast you were going or how much gas was left in the tank. The electronics were also prone to glitching out, completely leaving you driving down the highway with a blank black screen. Manufacturers went back to analog needles because knowing your speed shouldn't depend on the angle of the sun. 69. In the earliest days of motoring, cars used artillery-style wheels made of wooden spokes, just like a horse-drawn wagon. Wood is a terrible material for a heavy vehicle because it dries out, shrinks, and cracks over time, especially in hot weather. If you took a sharp corner at speed, the dried-out spokes could collapse under the lateral force, causing the wheel to disintegrate. The car would crash down onto its axle, often flipping over and causing a catastrophic accident. Steel wheels became the standard because driving on rot-prone organic material is a recipe for disaster on the highway. 70. As gas prices rose, scammers started selling magnetic devices called gas misers that you strap to your fuel line. The pitch was that the magnets would align the fuel molecules to make them burn better and double your gas mileage. It was complete pseudoscience that did absolutely nothing except lighten your wallet and add useless weight to your car. Thousands of people bought these useless gadgets hoping to save money, but they were just taping refrigerator magnets to a hose. The government eventually cracked down on these scams because you cannot defeat the laws of physics with a piece of magnetized plastic. 71. The Tucker 48 was famous for its safety innovations, but its center-mounted third headlight was confusingly dangerous to others. This Cyclops eye turned with the steering wheel to light up corners, which sounds smart until you meet oncoming traffic. Other drivers, seeing a single light in the middle of the lane, often panicked, thinking a motorcycle was heading straight for them. The sudden confusion caused oncoming cars to swerve unpredictably to avoid a collision that wasn't actually happening. The turning headlight was banned for years because startling other drivers with a wandering light beam is a great way to cause a crash. 72. The 8-track player is the legendary symbol of bad car audio because it was practically designed to fail. The bulky plastic cartridges would jam constantly, and the player made a loud mechanical clunk sound when it switched tracks. This track change would often happen right in the middle of your favorite song, ruining the moment completely. If the tape got tangled, you would end up with yards of magnetic ribbons spilling out of the dashboard while you tried to drive. The format died a painful death because nobody wants a music player that eats their favorite albums. 73. Classic cars are loved for their massive chrome bumpers, but those shiny metal bars were actually a blinding road hazard. On a sunny day, the mirror-like finish would reflect the sun directly into the eyes of drivers behind or approaching you. The intense glare could temporarily blind other motorists, causing them to squint or look away from the road. They also rusted rapidly in winter climates, turning the shiny chrome into a flaky orange mess within a few years. Painted plastic bumpers took over because they absorb impact better and don't act like a blinding solar weapon. 74. In rural areas, desperate drivers sometimes rigged their cars to run on propane by strapping a barbecue tank in the trunk. This do-it-yourself conversion was incredibly dangerous because the tanks were not designed for the vibrations of a moving vehicle. If the homemade lines leaked, the trunk would fill with explosive gas waiting for a single spark from a brake light. A rear-end collision could rupture the tank and cause a catastrophic blast that would destroy everything nearby. The practice was outlawed because driving around with a bomb in your trunk is strictly illegal for good reason. 75. Early minivans featured heavy sliding doors that did not have the safety locking mechanisms we have today. If the driver slammed on the brakes while the door was open, the heavy slab of metal would slide forward with crushing force. Parents loading groceries or children were at risk of having their fingers or limbs smashed by the momentum of the closing door. It was a guillotine on wheels that required constant vigilance to ensure nobody lost a hand in the parking lot. Safety latches were mandated because a family vehicle shouldn't have a door that attacks its passengers. 76. In the 50s, drivers installed curb feelers, which were metal springs that stuck out from the bottom of the wheel well. The idea was that the feeler would scrape the concrete curb and make a noise to warn you before you scratched your chrome rims. The problem was that the sound was a horrific metal-on-stone screech that sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard. It made parking your luxury car sound like you were crashing it, which was incredibly embarrassing for everyone involved. The gadget vanished because preserving your hubcaps was not worth making a noise that made everyone's teeth hurt. 77. The Continental Kit was an aftermarket accessory that extended the rear bumper to mount the spare tire upright behind the trunk. It added about 3 feet to the length of the car, making it impossible to fit into normal parking spots. The extra weight hanging off the back also upset the balance of the car, making the steering feel light and floaty. Parallel parking became a geometry exam that most drivers failed because the car was longer than the space itself. The trend ended because making your car longer and harder to drive is the opposite of an upgrade. 78. The Citroën Sahara was a unique attempt at four-wheel drive that used two completely separate engines, one in front and one in back. You had 2 ignition keys, 2 gas tanks, and 2 gearboxes linked by a complex system of rods. If one engine failed or ran out of gas, the car would handle bizarrely as you dragged the dead weight of the second motor. The noise of 2 engines screaming inside a tin can cabin was deafening for the passengers. It was discontinued because maintaining 2 engines just to drive one car is a headache nobody wants. 79. Luxury cars used to feature sharp metal hood ornaments that stood proudly on the nose of the vehicle like the Jaguar Leopard. While they looked aristocratic, they were essentially fixed spears aimed at the torso of any pedestrian the car might hit. In a collision, the ornament would not fold away but would act like a bayonet, causing severe puncture wounds to the victim. It turned survivable low-speed impacts into fatal stabbings for people crossing the street. Safety regulations banned fixed ornaments, forcing manufacturers to make them spring-loaded or remove them entirely to protect pedestrians. 80. In the 80s, technology was not ready for voice control, but that didn't stop car makers from trying it anyway. These early systems required you to shout specific commands like radio off, clearly and loudly while driving. Usually the system would misunderstand you and turn the volume up to maximum or change the station to static. Drivers would end up screaming in frustration at their dashboard while swerving in traffic, trying to get the radio to listen. The feature was dropped for years because yelling at your car is not a luxury experience, it is just a sign of madness. 81. In the 2000s, Nissan decided that symmetry was boring and released the Cube with a wraparound window on only one side of the car. It looked like the engineers simply forgot to install the pillar on the passenger side, giving the vehicle a lopsided and broken appearance. While it created a unique blind spot on the driver's side, it mostly just triggered the obsessive-compulsive disorder of everyone who saw it. People stared at the car trying to figure out if it had been in an accident or if the factory made a mistake. The design was abandoned because selling a car that looks like a manufacturing error is difficult. 82. When ethanol fuels first appeared, engineers discovered a major flaw, which was that alcohol hates waking up in the morning. Early ethanol-powered cars were notorious for refusing to start if the temperature dropped below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You would be sitting in your driveway turning the key while the alcohol sat in the tank refusing to vaporize like a stubborn teenager. Drivers were left stranded in the winter unless they kept their car in a heated garage or carried a can of starter fluid. The technology was updated with flex fuel systems because a car that takes snow days off is useless. 83. The most persistent myth in automotive history is the water-powered engine, which inventors have claimed to perfect for decades. These scammers promised cars that could run on tap water by splitting hydrogen on the fly, which defies the laws of thermodynamics. Investors would pour millions into these prototypes only for the inventor to mysteriously disappear or the car to be revealed as a fraud. While not a factory option, the pursuit of this fake science distracted from real innovation and scammed countless people. The concept remains banned by physics because you cannot get more energy out of water than you put into it. 84. In the 1980s, high-powered executives decided they needed to send documents while driving, so they installed fax machines in their cars. These bulky devices sat on the passenger seat and would start screeching and printing thermal paper while you were merging onto the freeway. The paper would curl up and fall onto the floor, forcing the driver to reach down and retrieve it while doing 60. It was the ultimate distraction that combined bad driving with the frustration of a paper jam. The technology became obsolete instantly because reading a blurry fax while dodging traffic is a death wish. 85. Saab once tried to revolutionize driving by replacing the steering wheel with a center-mounted joystick like a video game controller. The system, called Prometheus, removed the mechanical link to the wheels and relied entirely on sensitive electronics to steer. The problem was that the joystick was so twitchy that a sudden sneeze could send the car careening across 3 lanes of traffic. Test drivers found it exhausting to keep the car straight because it offered zero physical feedback from the road. The idea was scrapped because driving a 2-ton missile requires more precision than playing Pac-Man in an arcade. 86. Before the electric starter motor was invented, starting a car required hand cranking the engine from the front like a wind-up toy. You had to grip a heavy metal handle and spin the engine manually, which was exhausting and incredibly dangerous. If the engine backfired, the crank handle would spin backward with violent force and shatter your arm or smash your jaw. Doctors even had a specific medical term called the chauffeur's fracture for the broken bones caused by these killer handles. The electric key start was invented solely because starting your car shouldn't involve a trip to the emergency room. 87. The Porsche 911 made the Targa. Top famous, but early versions used a heavy glass panel that you had to remove manually. If your hands were sweaty or you lost your grip while lifting the glass roof, you would drop it directly onto your toes. Once removed, there was often no place to store the massive glass slab, so you had to leave it in your garage. If it started raining while you were out, you were completely out of luck and got soaked. The design evolved into mechanized sliding roofs because lifting heavy glass above your head is a bad idea. 88. For decades, every single car came equipped with a cigarette lighter, which was a glowing red-hot metal coil accessible to anyone. It was designed for lighting smokes, but was mostly used by bored children in the back seat to burn things. Kids would push the button, wait for it to pop, and then brand the upholstery or their younger siblings with the searing hot circle. It was a factory-installed fire hazard that caused countless interior burns and accidental fires. The lighter was finally replaced by plastic power outlets because giving toddlers a flameless torch is obviously negligent. 89. In a quest for better aerodynamics, designers in the 50s created skirted fenders that completely covered the rear wheels. While it made the car look sleek, it trapped the intense heat generated by the braking system inside the wheel well. On long drives, the brakes would overheat and fade completely, leaving the driver unable to stop the vehicle safely. In extreme cases, the trapped heat could even ignite the tire rubber or the grease in the axle. The skirts were removed from modern designs because letting the brakes breathe is more important than looking like a spaceship. 90. The Honda Prelude introduced mechanical 4-wheel steering, which turned the rear wheels to help cornering. When it worked, it was great, but if the mechanical alignment slipped, the car would start to crab walk down the road. You would be steering straight, but the car would be moving diagonally like a confused shopping cart, which was terrifying at highway speeds. Repairing the complex system was so expensive that most owners just welded the rear wheels straight when it broke. The feature was dropped because adding more moving parts to the steering just increased the chances of a crash. 91. In the 1980s, Ford tried to save money by using plastic fuel lines instead of steel ones on some of their vehicles. The problem was that the plastic would become brittle over time due to the extreme heat of the engine compartment. Eventually, the lines would crack and spray high-pressure gasoline directly onto the red-hot exhaust manifold. This resulted in sudden engine fires that would consume the entire car in minutes, often while the family was still inside. The company was forced to recall the design because saving pennies on fuel lines is not worth roasting your customers. 92. In the 1950s, choppy roofs were cool, but they made it impossible to see traffic lights if you were first in line at the intersection. The solution was the traffic light viewer, which was a plastic prism mounted on the dashboard to reflect the overhead light. It worked like a funhouse mirror that distorted the world and often confused the driver with strange reflections. Instead of looking at the road, you were squinting at a tiny piece of plastic, trying to see if the blob was green or red. The gadget disappeared because automakers simply designed windshields you could actually see out of. 93. The 1959 Cadillac featured tail fins that were nearly 4 feet tall and sharp enough to impale a low-flying bird. These massive wings acted like sails in a crosswind, making the car unstable and difficult to control on a windy highway. They were also a pedestrian nightmare, as the sharp rear edges could cause serious injury to anyone who walked into them. The era of the giant fin ended because they added useless weight and drag to the car without any benefit. Styles changed because driving a car that looks like a grounded rocket ship is ridiculous. 94. Volkswagen tried to convince the world that they had invented clean diesel technology that was powerful and environmentally friendly. It turned out to be a massive lie, enforced by software that cheated on emissions tests when the car detected it was being inspected. On the road, the cars were spewing 40 times the legal limit of nitrogen oxide, poisoning the air everyone breathed. The scandal cost billions and destroyed the reputation of diesel engines in passenger cars forever. The innovation was banned because calling a pollution machine clean does not actually make it good for the planet. 95. Before the late 60s, cars used a single circuit braking system where one master cylinder controlled all 4 wheels. If a brake line rusted through or a hose snapped, you lost 100% of your braking power instantly. You would press the pedal, and it would go straight to the floor, leaving you screaming as you rolled into traffic. There was no backup safety net, so a single leak meant a guaranteed accident. Governments mandated dual circuit systems because having a failure in one wheel shouldn't mean you have to crash the car. 96. Before Bluetooth existed, the only way to play a CD in an older car was using a cassette tape adapter. This device was a plastic tape with a wire hanging out of it that plugged into your portable player. The wire would inevitably dangle around the gear shift or get tangled in the steering wheel, creating a driving hazard. The audio quality was terrible, adding a mechanical hiss to every song you tried to play. It was a clumsy bridge technology that died out because having wires draped across your dashboard is ugly and dangerous. 97. In a bizarre trend, some drivers decided to glue shag carpet onto their dashboards to reduce glare from the sun. While it stopped the reflection, it turned the dashboard into a massive dust magnet that looked like a fuzzy mold experiment. The carpet would collect allergens and dirt, making the interior of the car smell like an old vacuum cleaner bag. In a crash, the unsecured carpet could detach and fly around the cabin, blinding the driver. The trend ended because people realized that putting a rug on your dashboard looks as stupid as it sounds. 98. The very first automobiles did not have electrical systems, so they used kerosene oil lamps for headlights. These lanterns were barely brighter than a candle and would frequently blow out if you drove faster than 20 miles per hour. You had to stop the car and relight your headlights with a match every time a gust of wind hit them. If the lamp leaked oil, it could drip onto the hot engine and start a fire right in front of the driver. Electric bulbs became standard because driving at night requires light that doesn't vanish in a breeze. 99. The Ford Skyliner was the first car with a retractable hardtop, and it used 7 motors and 10 relays to work. The mechanism was so complex that if a single sensor failed, the roof would get stuck halfway up. Drivers would be trapped on the side of the road with their trunk open and the roof blocking the rear view mirror. There was zero trunk space left when the roof was down, meaning you couldn't carry a single bag of groceries. The car was discontinued because a roof that needs a degree in engineering to operate is not practical. 100. Sony tried to revolutionize car audio with the minidisc player, which was a small digital disc inside a plastic cartridge. It was supposed to replace cassettes and CDs, but the format was expensive and nobody bought the albums. Car manufacturers installed the players for a few years, only to realize that consumers had zero interest in buying their music collection again. The players became useless bricks in the dashboard that could not play anything people actually owned. The format died a quick death because technology that nobody asked for is destined to fail. 101. In 1963, Chevrolet released the Corvette Stingray with a split rear window that looked like a spinal cord. It was a design masterpiece that divided the back glass into two separate panes with a thick fiberglass bar right down the middle. While it looked incredible from the curb, it completely blocked the driver's rearview mirror, creating a permanent blind spot. You could hide an entire police car behind that pillar and never see it until the sirens turned on. Owners actually took saws to their brand new cars to cut the bar out. Chevy removed it the very next year because seeing behind you is vital. 102. In the early 2000s, the movie Fast and Furious convinced everyone that they needed nitrous oxide to be cool. Some dealers and manufacturers flirted with factory-installed boost buttons that injected laughing gas into the engine for instant speed. The problem was that regular engines are not built to handle the sudden explosion of power and would often blow themselves apart. Pistons would melt, and engine blocks would crack, leaving the owner with a destroyed car and a voided warranty. The trend vanished because selling a car that destroys its own engine at the push of a button is a financial nightmare for everyone involved. 103. Off-road vehicles sometimes featured suspension seats that were mounted on springs to absorb the shocks of bumpy trails. The idea was to float the driver over the bumps, but in reality, it turned the seat into a dangerous trampoline. If you hit a large bump at speed, the seat would bounce upward violently, launching your head directly into the metal roof. Drivers were getting concussions and neck injuries just from driving over potholes in their own trucks. The seats were replaced with better shock absorbers because driving shouldn't involve getting knocked unconscious by your own ceiling. 104. Some high-end luxury sedans in the 90s introduced a feature called the gentleman's function located on the driver's side. It was a button that allowed the driver to electrically move and recline the front passenger seat without reaching over. While pitched as a convenience for chauffeurs, it was mostly used by drivers to mess with their sleeping friends. It was also viewed as creepy and controlling, giving the driver total command over the passenger's comfort. The feature quietly disappeared from most mass-market cars because it was a weird solution to a problem that didn't really exist. 105. The Austin Allegro is famous for being one of the worst cars ever made, and its square steering wheel was the cherry on top. They called it the Cordic wheel and claimed it allowed more legroom for the driver by flattening the bottom and top. In practice, it was awkward to turn because the shape didn't slide through your hands like a normal circle. Drivers lost their grip during sharp turns, causing panic and a loss of control. The shape was universally mocked and abandoned because reinventing the wheel is a metaphor for a reason, and making it square was just plain stupid. 106. In a bid to save space under the hood, some manufacturers placed the heavy lead-acid battery under the rear passenger seat. The massive design flaw was that charging batteries release hydrogen gas, which is highly flammable and toxic to breathe. Without proper ventilation, the cabin would fill with explosive gas, turning the car into the Hindenburg on wheels. If the backseat passengers smoked a cigarette, the entire interior could theoretically ignite in a flash. The batteries were moved back to the engine bay or sealed in trunks because sitting on top of an explosive gas leak is not a selling point. 107. The Chevrolet Corvair became infamous after Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, exposing its deadly suspension. The rear-engine car used a swing axle design that caused the rear wheels to tuck underneath the body during sharp turns. This sudden change in geometry would cause the car to lose grip and flip over violently, even at moderate speeds. Drivers would be cruising along 1 minute and rolling down an embankment the next with no warning. The suspension was redesigned, but the reputation damage was done, proving that keeping the wheels on the ground is priority number one. 108. Luxury car makers in the 90s decided that headlights needed their own tiny windshield wipers to keep them clean. These miniature wipers looked adorable, but they were incredibly fragile and prone to breaking off in a car wash. The motors would burn out constantly, leaving the tiny arms stuck halfway across the lens looking ridiculous. They also did a terrible job of actually cleaning dried mud or bug splatter off the glass. The industry switched to high-pressure washer jets because tiny mechanical arms were just another expensive thing to break on a fancy car. 109. In the late 60s, Dodge tried to appeal to the flower power generation by offering floral print vinyl roofs called mod tops. They took aggressive muscle cars like the Charger and plastered them with yellow and green flower patterns. The problem was that the people buying muscle cars wanted to look tough, not like they were driving a rolling tablecloth. The disconnect between the raw horsepower of the engine and the daisy print on the roof was laughable. The option was a massive sales flop because tough guys generally do not want their drag racing machine to look like a grandma's sofa. 110. Early automobiles like the Model T did not have fuel pumps, so they relied on gravity to feed gas to the engine. This meant the fuel tank was located directly in the dashboard right above the driver's lap. In a head-on collision, the tank would rupture and pour gallons of gasoline all over the driver and passenger before igniting. It was essentially a Molotov cocktail positioned between your knees while you drove down bumpy roads. Later cars moved the tank to the rear because sitting underneath a bomb was considered a poor safety feature for a family vehicle. 111. The Aero car was the ultimate promise of the future, a vehicle that could drive on the highway and fly through the clouds. The reality was that you had to tow the massive wings and tail section behind you on a trailer like a boat. When you wanted to fly, you had to stop and spend 30 minutes bolting the wings onto the car yourself. It was a terrible car because it was heavy, and a terrible plane because it was slow. The dream died because nobody wanted a vehicle that did two things badly instead of one thing. Well, congratulations! You just survived the deadliest commute in history without getting nuked, impaled, or launched out of a dog sack. If you want to keep your survival streak alive, smash that like button and subscribe to Dumb History. Or I will personally install a square steering wheel in your car tonight. Now, I have a serious question for you. Would you rather drive the nuclear bomb Ford or the flamethrower BMW? Let me know in the comments. I am reading every single answer. Now stop stalling and click the video on your screen right now to see more history that should have been illegal. Click it before it explodes. Stay safe.